We are now going to look at the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. You'll recall that I talked about dictators and Pompey and Caesar already. So if you look at my bullet point list here, Pompey was one of the people who became dictator. He made himself dictator. Then we had Caesar, and Caesar made himself dictator for life and then was assassinated. So here's what happens next. After the assassination of Julius Caesar, those senators who thought that they would restore the republic were actually branded as enemies of the state through a kind of clever speech given by Mark Antony. Mark Antony was Caesar's right-hand man. So Mark Antony was positioning himself to succeed Caesar. But he was a little surprised when a young man named Octavian stepped forward and announced that he was Caesar's nephew and heir. Caesar named Octavian in his will as his adopted son and heir. And in Rome, even though Octavian was a full-grown adult, to be named as the adopted son of Caesar made him absolutely recognized as the son of Caesar, and it gave him Caesar's name. So we call him Octavian, just to keep everybody straight. But at the time, he said, "I'm Julius Caesar." And he was. That was his new name. And he stepped forward with all of Caesar's money and Caesar's name and said, "I think I'd like to be in charge." So Octavian and Mark Antony and this other guy, Lepidus, sort of agreed to work together. Lepidus got squeezed out pretty quickly, and you have Octavian and Mark Antony, and they are completely in charge of the entire Roman Empire. They divided it. Octavian was in charge of the West, Mark Antony in the East. Mark Antony based himself in Egypt, and as you may know, he took up with the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. The two of them eventually ended up at war with each other, and the Battle of Actium, the naval battle of Actium, was the decisive battle in that war, and Octavian won. Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. So Octavian was left as the sole person in charge. Now he had seen his uncle, Julius Caesar, murdered for assuming too much power and making himself look too much like a king. Octavian was an incredibly smart man, and he realized that he had to play things very carefully. So he did not call himself dictator, he did not call himself king, he called himself princeps, which meant first citizen. I'm a citizen just like you, but first. And through a variety of means, he assumed all the power. So he let the Senate continue. There were always consuls. Everything happened as it did before. But he managed to pull all the strings. We'll just leave it at that. Eventually, he was given this honor of the title Augustus, which means kind of honored one. And he ruled until the year AD 14 or 14 CE. And once he gets that title, we call him Augustus. So that's his other historical name. We call him Augustus. And he is considered by us to be the first emperor of Rome. And we call this period the Roman Empire. Now he, remember though, didn't call himself emperor. One of his titles was imperator, which kind of means commander-in-chief. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call him an emperor, but we call him and the rulers that followed emperors of Rome. Now, He needed to maintain his authority. He had established this authority, but it wasn't based on any set system. There was no constitution giving him power. There were no laws giving him power. So he had to constantly do things to remind everyone that he was in charge and why. And his strongest tool to do that was art. Art and architecture. He used art and architecture as propaganda to constantly hammer home the message that he was the ruler and why. And now remember, I told you that in Rome, your authority is based on two things: who's your daddy and what have you done? And it was really hard for a young man to be taken seriously. Well, Augustus was a young man. Who's your daddy? That's easy. His daddy is Caesar, so he's going to really bank on that one. So there's a whole lot that he does to remind everyone that he's Caesar's son. What have you done was a little bit harder. He hadn't, clocked years of experience in Roman government. He had won the Battle of Actium, so that was something. There wasn't a whole lot else, at least at first. So anyway, this relationship with Caesar was really important. Now, what I'm showing you on this slide is part of the architecture that he did in Rome. Rome was not a very grand city at the time that Augustus became in charge, but he wanted it to be. And actually, Caesar first had that idea. Caesar had been to Egypt, had seen grand Hellenistic cities, and looked around Rome and said, this place is a dump. We need to make it look better. So he had embarked on a big building project, but then he got murdered. So Augustus picked up that idea. So look down on the bottom at that model of Rome, and you'll see the Forum of Julius Caesar and the Republican Forum, both of those in white. The Republican Forum, and you can read more about this in your textbook, was the ancient heart of the city of Rome. It's where all the governmental buildings were, temples, honorific monuments, etc. It was kind of a jumble of things, and it was really crowded and really busy after centuries. Caesar decided they needed a new public space, so he built a new forum adjacent to it, and you can see that there, the Forum of Julius Caesar. It's a Hellenistic style forum, meaning it's got a stoa or portico, a columned walkway enclosing it in a perfect rectangle, and a temple at one end. It looks like something from Pergamon. It's a very orderly kind of Greek-style forum. But he didn't get to finish it because he got murdered. So one of the first things Augustus does is he says, I'm going to honor my poor father, who everyone loves, remember, and finish his forum. And then he had Caesar deified, meaning made into a god. So then they could worship him at the temple right there. The temple, which was dedicated to Julius Caesar. So this was very clever because Romans were, as I said, kind of these pragmatic, humble farmer types. Nobody would have taken to Augustus naming himself a god, like Naram Sin had done back in Mesopotamia or the pharaohs do in Egypt. Can't do that in Rome. But he just said his father is a god. Julius Caesar is a god. And everybody was very willing to accept that because they loved Caesar. So that makes Augustus the son of a god. So he's pretty goddish. But he doesn't have to say that. So he's sort of like the king of the humble brag. He's always sort of claiming big things for himself while sounding humble at the same time. And this is an example of that. So he finishes Caesar's forum, and then he builds his own forum, which is marked in red there, right adjacent to it, the Forum of Augustus. And he makes it look exactly like Caesar's, just on a different orientation. And that way, everyone is reminded by the spaces they are in as they move through the city that Augustus is the son of Caesar. He's not letting them forget that for a minute. Now, in his forum, and maybe you can get a sense of this from the drawing up at the top, he made everything look very Greek. He really borrows heavily on Greek style. And in particular, he looks to 5th century Athens, the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the monuments of Athens, the classicizing style of Athens. And he does this for a very good reason. Athens was the home of democracy, and Augustus wants everyone to still think of Rome as a kind of democratic republic. We still have a Senate. It's still just as democratic as it always was. So thinking of Athens is positive. At the same time, though, Athens also had a little empire in the 5th century. So Athens is a perfect example of the Rome that he wants everyone to believe in. An empire and a democracy kind of forget about the fact that he's more or less made himself a king. Here's a portrait of Augustus. It's known as the Augustus of Prima Porta. And I'd like you to think about this in comparison to Greek sculpture, but also to Roman sculpture. In the last lecture, you looked at the veristic Roman portraits from the Republic. This portrait of Augustus does not look like that. There are certain things about his face that have that kind of realistic look to them. It shows him as sort of the 40-year-old that he was. He's not shown super young. He's not shown super old. He couldn't have a veristic portrait of himself made because he was not an old man. So faced with that impossibility, he invents a new style, or rather, he goes back to an old style. And here I'm showing you a comparison. There's our friend Augustus on the right. And on the left, do you remember this guy? Doryphorus, the Greek 5th century high classical sculpture, the spear bearer. They are twins. This is not a coincidence. There's differences, of course. Augustus is in the pose of a general giving a speech to his troops. He's wearing clothes because it's appropriate, but otherwise they look really, really similar. And this is for the same reason I just said. He wants you to think about Greek democracy and Greek empire and not really think about the fact that he's essentially a king. All right, this is another monument from the Augustan era, the time that Augustus was in charge. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes to try to stay on track here. Areopagus Augusti means the altar of Augustan peace. It does not celebrate Augustus, it celebrates peace. This is another example of an Augustan humble brag. At this point, when this thing was dedicated, he had won several major military campaigns in places like France and Spain, conquered those areas, brought them under control. Now, to do so, he killed millions of people, but he brought peace by killing everyone who opposed him. So the people of Rome said, we want to honor you. We want to honor you with, a parade. We want to give you all the military honors. And Augustus, being very humble, said, no, no, no. You've already honored me too much. It's just too much. I'm just a simple man. Don't honor me. Instead, honor peace, because we are all so grateful to be living in a peaceful world, thanks to me. So let's honor peace, specifically the peace that I brought, but peace, not me. So he's deflecting it. And the Romans would take concepts and turn them into goddesses and gods. So, for example, peace as a concept could be thought of as the goddess Pax, and you could worship her. You could worship this goddess, and you would be worshiping the concept of peace. So that's what this was for. It was an altar dedicated to the goddess Peace. And you can see through that doorway, you can catch a glimpse of the altar inside. It's an open-air building because altars have to be in the open air, so you can burn things and have the smoke go up to the gods. But the whole thing is enclosed in this beautifully sculpted sort of four-walled enclosure. It's really one of the most extraordinary examples of sculpture from the Roman world. And it's extraordinary in part because in the Augustan era, the way that Augustus appropriated style from 5th century Greece meant that everything made under Augustus had this sort of perfect, idealized, classicizing style. It was elegant, it was beautiful, because he was making it look Greek. And this building is an example of that. You can look at the beautiful garlands, the elaborate decoration, the elegant figures that are carved. Everything on this is beautiful. Here are a couple more images to show you the way it's set up. The altar on the inside with the garlands and cow skulls sort of alluding to sacrifices in the past, kind of eternal sacrifices. And then on the outside were images, here I'll show you, of a procession on either side. And it was the procession of the dedication of the monument. So of course, when they made this, the procession hadn't happened yet, but they made the image to show the procession, to sort of freeze it in time. This image, this procession, should remind you of another monument where we saw a procession of toga-draped figures in this sort of elegant Greek form. And I'm referring to the Parthenon frieze. And this wouldn't be a bad time for you to pause this slideshow and take a look at the images of the Parthenon frieze to compare it, because this is very, very heavily borrowing on that style. One thing that's different is that there are children here, and we don't usually see children in Greek art very frequently. They're probably here for two reasons. One, because this is the family of Augustus, and he wants everyone to know that there are children in the family, and that therefore his lineage will continue. And this is a very delicate concept, because think about it. Imagine their system of government is like our system of government. You're supposed to elect officials. So typically, we don't have the son or daughter of the president become president next, right? That's not the way it works. We elect someone else. Now, we have had in recent years some family dynasties, right? The Bushes, for example, or even arguably the Clintons. The Trumps look like they may be trying to establish a family dynasty where the children sort of inherit the family name and become politically powerful next in line. But that's not the way our system works. So there's still a sense that that person has to earn it and they have to be elected to that position. And it was the same in Rome. As important as your family was, you needed to earn your right to power. And officials were supposed to cycle through and be elected. So the idea that Augustus was going to remain in charge his whole life and then have a dynastic successor was really in direct opposition to the principles of the Roman Republic. And that's why we call it an empire after that. It's an imperial system, a dynastic system. But the Romans weren't really ready to accept that change was happening. So Augustus had to be very subtle about it. So he never comes right out and says, my son-in-law or my grandson is going to succeed me. Instead, he just shows these images of children to sort of remind everyone, yes, my line can continue, and it will continue, but let's not talk about that. Okay, let's look at another panel from the Areopagus. This is a really beautiful and well-preserved panel. It might show Pax, or it might be another personification of Tellus or Earth. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. What it shows is clearly an image of peace and plenty, the world in a good state, thanks to Augustus, with resources in the form of animals and plants in abundance around. And it's a very classicizing image. This female in the center, she could sit right up there on the Parthenon pediment with those three goddesses lounging, and she would be perfectly at home there. That's a good test of whether something is classical in style. Could you take a figure and stick them on the Parthenon and have them blend in? If the answer is yes, then you're looking at something classical. This is another monument from the Augustan era. It's a temple, obviously. This one happens to be in France. It's called the Maison Carrée, and it's from Nîmes in France. Maison Carrée just means square house, but that's the name that's been stuck on it. But it's a Roman temple that happens to be a really beautifully preserved temple in France. And it's a reminder to us that as the Romans conquered all of these regions and turned them into Roman provinces, they then exported their Roman culture onto those provinces. So they built temples and roads and fora and theaters and etc. everywhere that they conquered. So they brought Roman civilization to these places. So there are examples of Roman architecture preserved from all corners of the Roman world. This is also an opportunity for us to see how temple architecture changes a little bit under Augustus, and let me show you a comparison. Okay, so on the left is that temple we looked at in the last lecture from the Roman Republic, the Temple of Portunus. On the right is the Maison Carrée from Nîmes. They're really similar, right? Each one has that kind of basic Etruscan temple form with some Greek modifications, like the fake peristyle. The Republican one on the left has Ionic columns. On the right, it has these very decorative, beautiful, elegant Corinthian columns. Everything made under Augustus is elegant, courtly, appropriate for a king. He made things fancy, and that's what you can see here. You'll also notice it has 6 columns across the front, which gives it a grander look, and that's also characteristic of Augustus. Finally, I want to say about this temple that the one on the right, that it had a dedication in bronze letters on the front, and the bronze has long since been pulled off and melted down, but the pinholes from that in the stone allowed historians to recreate the inscription, and it was dedicated to the grandsons of Augustus. So this brings us back to that question of succession. Augustus was pretty obsessed with who was going to succeed him. he had one daughter, and he had a nephew who he forced to marry his daughter, so he then was also his son-in-law, Marcellus. Marcellus was going to be his heir, but Marcellus died. Then he made his daughter marry his right-hand man, Agrippa, and Agrippa died. But they had two sons, so these grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, then they were going to be the successors. And this temple was dedicated to them, and that's what the bronze letters said. The princes of youth. But then they died. So Augustus was really in a pickle. He had no sons or grandsons by blood. So he eventually made his stepson, Tiberius, his heir, which he was reluctant to do because Tiberius wasn't related by blood. But he named Tiberius his heir.